The city of Bath in Somerset in the southwest of England is one of the most beautiful and picturesque cities in the whole of the United Kingdom. Named after the ancient Roman bathhouses that originally put it on the map many centuries before in 60 AD, the city became a World Heritage Site in 1987, although its age-old pavements have been a top destination for domestic and international tourists for well over 2 centuries. Centred around the River Avon, Bath is a city of stone bridges, pretty courtyards, winding narrow alleyways and stunning Georgian architecture. The city boasts the breathtaking Bath Abbey as well as one of the oldest houses in England, the endearingly small Sally Lunn Bakery, renowned for its baked buns, which were by all accounts a favourite of American President Abraham Lincoln whenever he visited the British Isles. Altogether, Bath is, on the surface, a quintessential postcard place to live and visit. However, for the last 30 years, this beautiful, charming city has been preyed upon by a prolific serial rapist who, as of the writing of this podcast exclusive, has committed at least 17 violent sexual assaults, evaded capture, and continuously frustrated the authorities, desperately trying to bring his reign of terror to an end. A reign of terror that the now retired lead detective Paul James of the Avon and Somerset Constabulary stated was one of the most complicated and protracted investigations in the history of the force, and the UK's longest-running serial rape investigation. This is a truly criminal podcast exclusive. This is the case of the Bath Rapist. It was Tuesday, May 21st, 1991, and Cher's Shoop Shoop song was dominating the UK charts and the country's radio waves for the last 8 weeks. The film adaptation of Stephen King's best-selling novel Misery had just hit the box office, scaring moviegoers all over Britain, and Queen Elizabeth had just become the first ever British monarch to address the United States Congress. The weather that week had been unusually warm for that time of year, with temperatures reaching 25 degrees Celsius on most days. However, in the early hours of that particular May morning, when a 36-year-old woman was returning home from working a long night shift, the air had taken on a much chillier feel to it. As the woman finished parking her car in a garage near her home on Coronation Avenue, southwest of the city centre, she was startled as a man grabbed her from behind, threw her on the ground, and threatened her with what looked like a knife. The victim said of the attack, "I just thought it was some sort of wild practical joke first of all, and then in my naivety I thought he was trying to mug me, take my checkbook and money. Then I realised that wasn't what he was after." The attacker began to rip and tear at the petrified woman's clothes, especially her nylon tights, only stopping when he was startled by a stray cat dashing down the darkened alley. Seemingly spooked, the perpetrator then forced the woman back into her vehicle at knife point and drove her to a deserted country lane just outside of the city limits called Combe Lane, where he violently ripped and tore at her tights and then brutally raped her. After the attack, he then ordered the woman to get dressed again and then drove her back to the place he had originally abducted her from, telling her not to call the police and then fleeing back into the darkness. These two significant and signature acts, the ripping of the nylon tights and then driving the victim back to where he had initially ambushed them, would become the rapist's trademarks, and the modus operandi the Avon and Somerset Constabulary would utilise in their attempts to catch him. The rapist's fetishistic compulsion to rip his victim's tights would be concretely proven to authorities when, 5 months later in the chilly month of October, as children were gearing up for the Halloween festivities, he struck again. This time ambushing his second victim, an 18-year-old, as she walked home from a night out with friends. The young woman was walking alone when she was grabbed and dragged into an alleyway close to the city centre on Bathick Hill, and then forced at knife point to walk to a nearby field. She was pushed into shrubbery and then blindfolded with a bright pink elastic hairband. Once the attacker realised that she wasn't wearing any tights, he produced a new pair from his jacket and forced her to put them on, telling her to be careful to not rip them. When the woman had done what he told her to do, the attacker immediately proceeded to tear the tights off her and then viciously sexually assault her. Although the attacks had taken place late at night or in the early hours of the morning, and despite being blindfolded, the victims were able to give the investigators a vague description of the rapist. It was a description that would be echoed almost identically numerous times over the coming decades by nearly all of the Bath Rapist's victims. He's described as clean-shaven, a middle-aged white man of average build and between 5'8" and 5'10". He has very striking blue eyes and a small scar underneath his bottom lip. He's always wearing dark-coloured clothing, possibly black or navy, and often wears a dark baseball cap. He is believed to have a very in-depth knowledge of Bath, the streets and the surrounding country lanes. If he is still alive today, it's believed he may be in his 50s or 60s. After the second attack, as the women of Bath grew more frightened by the day, the Avon and Somerset police force ramped up their efforts to catch him. This would be the start of Britain's longest-running rape investigation, codenamed Operation Eagle. Roadblocks were put up around the scenes of the attacks, and drivers were asked if they had been in the areas at the time of the sexual assaults. Newspapers and other media outlets put out pleas for information. Detectives checked out tip-offs and officers canvassed the areas with a fine-tooth comb, hoping for any shred of evidence the rapist may have left behind. Sadly, like many such cold cases we have previously covered on the Truly Criminal podcast, in the early weeks and months of the investigation, nothing substantial turned up, except a tangled web of leads that led investigators nowhere. Lead detective Paul James recollected, "One of the reasons I became involved at that time was due to my training and specialist knowledge of linking serious crimes. At that time, offender profiling was quite high on the agenda, where I used my expertise, and with the use of expert profilers, we looked at the behaviour characteristics of the offender. We broke down activities before, during and after the crime to try and come up with a picture of the person we were looking for, a man who's determined and not afraid to be quite brazen at times. For instance, he has committed offences one after another on the same night. He presents a real danger and we need to catch him." Possibly intimidated by the heavy ongoing investigation into his crimes, the rapist quickly disappeared. As the weeks passed by and the news stories began to fade away from the front pages of the tabloid newspapers, so did the people of Bath's fear of the monster stalking their streets. However, the rapist wasn't gone for good, and would attack his third victim as she sat in her parked vehicle in November of 1994. It had been 3 years since the last attack, and it was in close proximity to where the offender had ambushed the 18-year-old in October of 1991. He jumped into her car brandishing a knife and pushed her into the passenger seat. He then drove the victim onto the grounds of the nearby Bath American Museum and Gardens, blindfolded her with the same pink hairband he had used previously, tore the tights from her body, and then subjected her to a horrifying sexual assault. As on the previous incidents, after raping the woman, he drove her back to where he had initially carjacked her, reportedly threatening the victim not to call the police, or he would burn her house down. After committing his third known rape, the Bath Rapist once again disappeared. Falling off of the authorities' radar altogether, this time he would be inactive for over 2 years. This unusual pattern of committing violent sexual attacks and then disappearing for years at a time would become another of the rapist's unusual traits that detectives would try to use to identify him. Paul James stated later, "One of the key things for us was that there was some significant time gaps of 2 to 3 years of offences taking place. One of the big things we looked at was there a reason why an individual couldn't offend in that period of time? Could he have been in prison? Could he have been away? All sorts of reasons. We came up with quite a big criteria for eliminating and bringing in suspects. So where was the Bath Rapist going in those years of inactivity? Was he serving time in prison, perhaps for burglaries, as James and his colleagues suspected? Was he living overseas and committed crimes whenever he came back to Bath to visit relatives? Perhaps he was in the armed forces, or did the years of inactivity mark the start of sexual relationships, where a new romantic partner possibly fulfilled the attacker's fetishes? Another possibility to explain the long gaps is that this is a man who comes to the area infrequently, perhaps for work reasons. We need to talk to anyone who might be able to explain why he has operated in this way," added Inspector Keith Jones, who was also working on the case. The Bath Rapist would soon be back on the authorities' radar. In September of 1996, he committed another sex attack. However, this time, he had, for the first and only time, changed his hunting ground to that of Kingswood, Bristol. As with the first victim, a 19-year-old woman was sat in her car in the early hours of the morning. She was threatened with a knife placed to her throat, carjacked and driven to an isolated location, and then sexually assaulted. However, this time was different. The rapist for the first time became lost while driving the victim back to where he had abducted her from. He didn't seem to know where he was going. Becoming more and more agitated, he finally removed the pink elastic hairband that he was using to blindfold her and asked her to give him directions to her house. It was an important clue for the authorities tracking him, The attacker, whilst obviously a native or someone extremely knowledgeable of Bath, was a total stranger to Bristol. Detectives narrowed down their suspects to those living in or around Bath. The rapist also left behind another significant piece of evidence on the seat of the victim's car: the pink hairband. In October, the rapist was back stalking the streets of Bath and attempted to ambush a woman getting into her car at a car park in Sydney Mews at around 5 p.m. Fortunately, the woman in her 30s spotted the assailant in the nick of time and managed to quickly lock the driver and passenger doors as the rapist frantically tried to get inside the car. Unsuccessful, he ran away from the scene, only to claim another victim in Rosemount Lane, a little way across the city just 30 minutes later. She was a 16-year-old girl walking home from school. The attacker robbed and then raped her. In January and February of 1997, the Bath Rapist attempted to claim 3 more victims who were parking their cars. Luckily, in these cases, the women, who were now well aware of the Bath Rapist, fought back and managed to escape. As the attack seemed to be escalating and the national press piled the pressure on the authorities to catch him, Avon and Somerset police continued to step up their efforts to bring his awful crimes to an end. Many of the detectives referred to the attacker as the Riddler because he seemed to evade capture and baffle investigators at every turn. Possibly intimidated once again by the constant media coverage of his crimes and the police investigators hot on his tail, or perhaps because he had started a new relationship or left the country altogether, the Bath Rapist once again disappeared for 2 years. When he reappeared, the attacker would give the public and press another shocking piece of evidence, creating a new moniker: the Batman Rapist. In January of 1999, the rapist carjacked a 39-year-old woman driving in the pretty and sleepy village of Beckford Gardens just outside Bath. The woman was forced into the passenger seat at knife point and threatened as the attacker sped away from the scene. However, as the rapist stopped at a red light, the woman courageously opened the car door and ran screaming towards a nearby petrol station. The rapist's plan had failed. He fled from the vehicle and disappeared into the back alleys that he seemed to know like the back of his hand. In his rush to get away from the scene, the offender left behind an old black baseball cap on the driver's seat. The baseball cap was an official merchandise from the 1995 movie Batman Forever, and in a strange coincidence, it had the Batman character Riddler's iconic question mark with the words Batman Forever on it. Hence the Bath Rapist then became known as the Batman Rapist. On this occasion, as with the last couple of attacks where his victim managed to escape, the rapist was unperturbed and went on to commit another rape just 20 minutes later. He abducted a woman parking her Mini Cooper on her driveway on the upmarket Prior Park Road. The victim bravely told the UK's Crime Watch programme in 2000 of the horrific ordeal she had endured. It was just a matter of seconds. There was no way that even if I'd had a mobile phone that I could have rung anybody to save myself. My head was working, but my body was floppy as if it didn't belong to me. I had to try and remember everything. This guy had, I would say, quite a normal physique. He wasn't fat, and he certainly wasn't skinny or bony. He wasn't a hairy guy. Even though my head was squashed on his thigh, I couldn't smell washing powder or sweat. Really strange, someone who was very well scrubbed. The car is really old, it does stall. I couldn't get over how he drove the car as if he'd driven a Mini always. When the car did stop, he put a blindfold over my eyes. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see down to my toes. I didn't know what was going on. I was so scared, so frightened. Even when it was all happening, it's still the thought of, am I going to get away? The Bath Rapist drove the woman around the city's surrounding country lanes for almost 30 minutes before deciding to pull up into a lay-by just off of the A36. The lay-by was secluded and reportedly used by teenagers and other couples in the city as a quiet and private place to have sex. Here the rapist's attack echoed all of the others he had previously committed. The victim's tights were torn from her body. She was violently sexually assaulted and then driven back to where she had been abducted from. The woman went on to say that she refused to let the attack ruin or dictate her life. I am not going to let him change me, push me into a corner. Bastard. Over the course of the last decade, one pertinent fact had become evidently clear to the investigators of Operation Eagle. The Bath Rapist, or the Batman Rapist as he was now known, was an opportunistic attacker, preying on women of all ages and types. And although some of his victims had been robbed of small amounts of money, his crimes were entirely sexually motivated. His attacks were also becoming more and more brazen. On a late Friday night in May of 2000, the rapist tried to kidnap a woman who was sat in her vehicle with her 7-year-old in the back seat. He was only thwarted when the 26-year-old mother managed to wrestle the door closed, lock it, and repeatedly sound the horn to call the attention of a passerby. Following the last terrifying attack, Crime Stoppers and the local Bath Chronicle newspaper offered up a reward of £10,000 for any information, leading to the capture of the Bath Rapist. A few months after that, in October 2000, Operation Eagle sent out a staggering 25,000 leaflets to homes in and around Bath. The leaflets were both a warning and a plea for information to the women of the city. Did they know someone who would often go out in the late evenings in the winter months? Someone who matched the description, someone who perhaps had shared their sexual fetish for ripping tights with them. The leaflets and the appeal from Crime Watch UK produced a large number of tip-offs, with over 2,000 people calling the police with information. The Operation Eagle detectives also received a significant number of rape reports that they would later link to the Bath Rapist. Although they still theorised the actual number of his victims is much higher than the current reported 17. One of the tip-offs that grabbed the attention of the investigators was that of a son of a diplomat. He lived abroad with his father but intermittently returned to Bath to visit family. The suspect not only matched the description of the Bath Rapist, he had also grown up in Bath and knew the streets extremely well. Detectives with Operation Eagle travelled out to the still undisclosed country to interview the son and his diplomat father. Whilst they were there, they also collaborated with the local police force to investigate whether any rapes matching the MO of those being committed in Bath had occurred there. Unfortunately, the results of this investigation have never been released or made known to the public. By 2001, the authorities had in their possession the DNA fingerprint of the rapist, and it was used to clear over 2,000 suspects named in Operation Eagle. Retired Detective James told BBC Bristol at the time, "It's very simply a question of going round and seeing these people and asking them to provide us with a DNA sample, which obviously we can test against stuff we have in our possession. It may well be that one of the people in our system that we're going to visit could well be the offender. It's equally possible he's not in our system yet." The last known reported attack by the Bath Rapist took place 24 years ago, and some detectives believe he may be dead now. The ex-lead investigator recently said, "You have to hypothesise, is he dead, or is there some other reason why the offending behaviour has stopped?" On the 5th of October 2009, a motorway maintenance worker who was cleaning away trash littering the sides of the M5 found a bag containing human remains. The bones were later linked via DNA to those of a missing 26-year-old hospital worker, Melanie Hall. She had disappeared 13 years before, on the night of the 9th of June 1996. Melanie had last been seen leaving the popular Bath nightclub, Cadillacs, located in the city centre, as she began walking home alone. Is it possible that Melanie was a victim of the Bath Rapist? Had his horrific crimes escalated to murder? Detectives with the Avon and Somerset Police are keeping an open mind and believe Melanie's murder may possibly have been the work of the Bath Rapist. But until there are any further developments on this case as of 2024, the identity of the Bath Rapist and the true extent of his crimes remain unknown. The case is cold, but according to ex-detective James, it is far from dead. He said these types of crimes are never written off until they are actively solved. Avon and Somerset Police has a really good record over the last few years of solving cold cases. For me as a detective, I did 30 years and since then established a successful business and working all over the world. But this for me is the one crime that really, from my career perspective, I would love to see solved. It was a case that became all-consuming as a detective and as a team of detectives because I met all of the victims. And when you do that, you really want to, for them, give them some closure. It is one of my big regrets when I retired from the police. People ask me if I had one regret, and it always has been how we never actually got to the bottom of this case. But I will never give up on it. There is certainly material there that is available to convict the offender if we catch him. If he's still alive, then I think in the fullness of time, I think that will happen. We hope that by bringing this case back into the eyes of the wider public, it may light a spark and someone may remember something that could be pertinent to this case. If the Bath Rapist is still alive today, he will be in his 50s or 60s. He's described as white, of average build, between 5'8" and 5'10", striking blue eyes and a small scar underneath his bottom lip, and he also has an in-depth knowledge of the city of Bath. We would love to see this decades-old cold case solved and this reign of terror finally brought to an end. There are so many questions that desperately need to be answered. Victims deserve justice and voices need to be heard. The £10,000 reward leading to the rapist's arrest is still unclaimed. Anyone with information is asked to please call Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111.